In this week's video, we're going to look at yet another attribute of God. This time, we'll look at God's eternity. Now, for most of us, we probably already think we have a good understanding of what it means for God to be eternal. And in the most basic understanding of eternity, we're probably right. But there's more to God's eternity than you might think. And to see this, we're going to have to think a little bit about time. What is time, and how does it affect us? As space is measured in distance, time is measured in duration. The standard of unit for time is something we are all very much familiar with. The standard unit of measure is a second. For those nerds listening to this podcast or watching this video, they will know that a second is the radiation frequency of a cesium atom. But for many of us, especially those as old as me, we know a second to be equal to about 1 Mississippi. Now we accumulate seconds into larger intervals of time, like minutes, hours, days, or even years, centuries, millennia. This labeling of time as a period of duration and then measuring it by the accumulation of seconds is fairly simple. We all do this all the time, pun intended. But defining what time is, well, this is not so easy. St. Augustine once wrote, "What then is time? Provided that no one asks me, I know. If I want to explain it to someone, I do not know." I think I feel exactly what Augustine was feeling. Time is so commonplace to me that I feel as if I know what it is better than almost anything. I plan it out each day. I break down the day into manageable pieces of time. I read about events long ago and I mentally place them into a period of time. I even think on things yet future, and I place those events into periods of time, like maybe an upcoming vacation next summer or the Christmas holiday this December. But when I stop for a moment to think about these things, whether my day planner for the week or the events of the Reformation 500 years ago, none of these things I'm measuring actually exist. Now that's a disturbing thought. All of my measurements of time are simply ways for me to consistently relate certain events, whether past or future, to my current moment and to each other. But the events of the past, they no longer exist. They are now past. And the events of the future, well, they're yet to exist. Therefore, time is simply the succession of moments and the events happening in those moments, to which we then apply a standard unit of measure to record and identify just one dimension of their relationship to one another. Let's look at an example. In 1517, in Wittenberg, Germany, a monk by the name of Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church. Wittenberg, Germany is a place in the dimension of space. I can measure its relation to other places in space. For example, it is approximately 600 miles from Paris, France, and nearly 93 million miles from the sun. Wittenberg is a place relative to all other places, and I use distance to measure that relation. October 31st, 1517, was a time in the past. From where I am at this moment in time, it was 185,189 days ago. It was also 12,408 days after Martin Luther was born, and 10 days before his 34th birthday. We can see how we use time to measure the relation of one thing to another, even of things that no longer exist. Like we measure the distance between objects to place them properly in space, we measure their separation from each other by longer or shorter durations to place them properly in time. This is why physicists define time as the succession of events from past to future. Each and every moment is relative to that which came before it and to that which comes after it. Now, this is very important to our understanding of eternity. Time is intrinsically relative, one moment relating to another in succession, and therefore time is essentially change. For this reason, modern physicists recognize that a system without change is in fact timeless. Now, if that doesn't blow our minds, nothing probably will. But this brings us to an interesting thought that was proposed by St. Augustine. He argued that time is a conception of the human mind. He rightly said that events that are past no longer exist. We have memories of them, but that is all. We may write down what happened so that we can share it with others, but the events themselves, even the state of the things that were and still remain, has changed. That state in which all things were a moment ago no longer exists. Let me give you an example. I have a big tree in my backyard. It has stood there for probably 50 years. The tree, from all appearances, is the same today as it was yesterday. But suppose a big storm came through my neighborhood last evening and knocked one of its branches to the ground. When I look out my window in the morning, I will see a branch on the ground. The tree of the past, the tree with the branch still attached to it, no longer exists. The only tree that exists is the tree with the broken branch. However, the day before the storm, the only tree that existed was the tree with the branch yet unbroken. The tree with the broken branch didn't exist yet. But in our consciousness, because of memory, often informed by historical accounts or evidence acquired, like a picture of the tree with the unbroken branch, we are able to arrange events relative to other events and recall them in both space and time, like the events of October 31st, 1517 in Wittenberg, Germany. And so if you think about your life and your experience of it, the only things that truly exist are those things happening right at this moment. Everything is constantly moving from yet to be, the future, to being, the present, to used to be, the past. And the moment we call now is the only moment we have. And yet, how long is that moment? Aristotle called it a knife's edge with no width. This is where we live. We remember the past. I remember the tree without the broken branch. But that past no longer is. I can't get it back. I can't change it. It's gone. Every one of us has a past of events and actions and thoughts and feelings, none of which we can grab hold of, none of which we can alter in any way. Things from the past may endure, but what they were in the past is not the same as what they are in the present, or what they might or might not be in the future. Now, how all of this relates to the eternity of God is what we must look at next. Francis Turretin defines God's eternity as follows: the infinity of God in reference to duration is called eternity, to which these three things are ascribed. Number one, that God's eternity is without beginning. Number two, it is without end. And number three, it is without succession. That is, the duration of a thing as to present, past, and future. Now, the first two of these things is what we commonly think of when we think of God's eternity. God has no beginning. We covered this in our study of aseity. God is self-existing. He has life in himself. He is not created. He is alone creator. And God has no end. His being goes on forever and ever. Now, this is precisely what we find in the scripture as recorded in Psalm 90, verse 2. You are from everlasting. God's duration goes infinitely backward, having no beginning, from everlasting. And it goes infinitely forward to everlasting. That God has no beginning is one of the key differences between God and those of his creatures to whom he's given immortality. Here I speak of angels and men. Specifically, as it relates to us as mankind, we've been given an immortal soul. Prior to our conception, we didn't exist. Our soul didn't exist. But when we were conceived in our mother's womb, we became a living soul. And to that soul, God gives immortality. This means that it will go on forever into the future. God, however, is not simply immortal, having an unending life. God is eternal, having a life that is without beginning and without ending. God has a life that is an infinite duration. Now, this concept of the infinity of God's duration, described as having no beginning and no ending, is the common understanding of God's eternity among modern Christians, and this is good and it's right. But what is often missing from our thinking about God's eternity is what Terraton described in his third point: God is without succession, without duration as to past, present, and future. This is why it's important to spend some time talking about time. God does not exist in time. He is not bound by time. To think of God's being as going back in time infinitely is still to think of God as if he were like us, defined by time, constrained by time, by past, present, and future. But God is without beginning. He is before time. He is above time. He is not contained by time, but contains all time in himself. In the beginning, God, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, John 1:1. These phrases tell us that when time and space began, and they began simultaneously, God already was. He already existed because he is the one who created all that is, including time. All that is in space and time is contained in God. His immensity is not constrained by the limits of space, and his eternity is not constrained by the limits of time. Terraton explains it like this: For the eternal duration of God embraces indeed all time, past, present, and future. But nothing in him can be past or future, because his life remains always the same and immutable. God alone has no past. He embraces all of eternity in a single and immutable present. There is nothing in God that is first and nothing in God that is last. In his perfection, he is eternally all that he is at all times. The Puritan theologian Stephen Charnock described it like this: The being of creatures is successive. That is to say, we are in time with a past, a present, and a future. The being of God is permanent. That is, eternal, immutable, without past, present, or future, and remains entire with all its perfections unchanged in an infinite duration. Charnock goes on to point out the same three parts of God's eternity that Terraton did. Indeed, the first notion of eternity is to be without beginning and end. These are the first 2 points of Terraton's definition, which notes to us the duration of a being in regard of its existence. But to have no succession, Terraton's third point, nothing first or last, notes rather the perfection of a being in regard of its essence. Now we need to look at one more quote, and then take a look at the Bible and see if it talks about God in these categories. Does the Bible define God's eternity like what we've seen so far? Here's a simple definition of God's eternity from 20th century Reformed theologian Gerhardus Voss. What is God's eternity? That attribute of God whereby he is exalted above all limitations of time. In other words, having no beginning and no ending, and all succession of time. That is, having no past, present, and future. And in a single, indivisible present, what we might call an eternal now, possesses the content of his life perfectly. Let's look again together at Psalm 90, verses 1 and 2, and begin to see that the Bible speaks of God's eternity in exactly these categories. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or even you had formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. We have already seen that this verse tells us that God has no beginning and no ending. But what we often don't see, and what I think we need to focus on in this verse, is the last phrase. In this phrase, we learn more than simply the reality of God's unending existence. Listen carefully to what this verse says. Even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Not you were God. Not you will always be God. That would be to place God within the bounds of time, even if those bounds have no beginning and no ending. But the psalmist worships God by singing, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. This may seem like I'm overstretching the grammar, but when we compare this verse to other verses, we begin to see more clearly what the psalmist was thinking. He was thinking, like Gerhardus Voss, God in one single indivisible present possesses the content of his life perfectly. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God. This accords perfectly with the divine name given to Moses in Exodus 3:14. God said to Moses, I am who I am, and he said, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent me to you. The divine name, I am, doesn't only indicate God's self-existence, but it declares to us his immutability and his eternity. God is the God who is. From everlasting to everlasting, you are, present tense, God. Jesus shows us this in John 8:58. So the Jews said to him, you are not yet 50 years old, and you have seen Abraham? Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was born, I am. Therefore they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. Jesus makes reference here to the divine name given to Moses, I am, using the simple Greek phrase, ego eimi. By using this phrase, Jesus showed most clearly his claim to being himself God. As a result of this, the Jews picked up stones to stone him for what they considered to be blasphemy. But let's pause for a moment and consider both what Jesus said and what he did not say, and how his words affect our understanding of God's eternity. Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was born, I am. Jesus did not say before Abraham was born, I was. Now, this could have been said of an angel. Angels have a past. They have a point in time they were created, and they exist within time, even though they will live on forever. If Jesus were an angel, he would have rightly said, before Abraham was born, I was. Suppose he were Enoch returned to Israel as a prophet. He would have been correct to say, before Abraham was born, I was. But Jesus takes unto himself that which alone belongs to God. the self-existent one who dwells in the indivisible present of eternity. Before Abraham was born, I am. For you and me, like every other created thing, we can be described as we were, we are, and we will be. We have a past, a present, and a future. We exist within the limitations of time, and our existence is ever changing over the course of time. But God is not I was, I am, and I will be. God does not change. God does not have a past. God is in one single indivisible present called I am, and He alone possesses the content of His life perfectly, infinitely, and eternally. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. No change, no succession of moments, one indivisible and eternal present. This is precisely what the 19th century theologian Louis Berkhoff describes when he says, "Our existence is marked off by days and weeks and months and years. Not so with the existence of God. Our life is divided into a past, present, and future. But there is no such division in the life of God. He is the eternal I am. His eternity may be defined as that perfection of God whereby He is elevated above all temporal limits and all succession of moments and possesses the whole of His existence in one indivisible present." Much about God's eternal power and Godhead has been revealed to mankind through the things which have been made, so that they are without excuse. But to us, His elect children, believers, He has spoken in His word and through His Son. He has revealed Himself to be I am, the self-existing, never-changing, eternal one. From a practical perspective, the eternity of God is one of the most comforting truths a Christian can know. It tells us that God has from all eternity had one unchanging plan, one decree, as eternal as God Himself, though not to be equated with His being in essence, but having its source in His eternal and infinite will. That decree is being carried out in time, in a succession of moments. But that decree is one decree. It is eternal. And every part of it, every aspect of it, is the carrying out of one eternal act. This means that nothing that happens in our lives is an accident. And it means that the future is as certainly under the control of God as was the past. His very word stands true because He is eternal. His very sovereignty is dependent upon His eternity. And it is this eternity, understood not simply as an infinite duration, but as God possessing His infinite perfections in one indivisible present, without succession, without change. It is that forms the firm and permanent foundation of our lives. I think the Christian band Casting Crowns captured this truth and its practical application for us in their song, Already There. When I'm lost in the mystery, to you, my future is a memory, 'cause you're already there. You're already there. God is already there in our future. To Him, it is as certain as the past. To God, my future is now, even as my past is now. This is the meaning of, to you, my future is a memory. God sees the future even as the past, as the outworking of His eternal plan. He sits above time. He contains all time in Himself. I can take comfort in the unknowable tomorrow because God is already there. Tomorrow and all that will happen in it is the outworking of His one plan for all creation. A plan that the one who dwells in eternity is working out in time with perfect conformity to that perfect will which conceived it in His infinite and eternal mind. And that plan includes the most minute part of my existence. What happens to me tomorrow is not insignificant, not to God. He has it planned and under control. He is already there. Thanks for joining me for this video on God's eternity. Until next time, bye for now.